A German garrison of barely 6,000 men was cut off in a frozen wasteland and attacked for 105 straight days by forces several times its size, and it did not collapse. What sustained this pocket when ammunition ran out, the wounded piled up, and air supply was being shot from the sky? The answer reshapes how modern armies understood encirclement, endurance, and the true cost of holding the impossible. By late 1941, the Eastern Front had transitioned from a rapid campaign of movement into a fragmented line of contested zones, supply routes, and exposed garrisons. Following the start of Operation Barbarossa on 22 June 1941, German Army Group North advanced through the Baltic states toward Leningrad, while Army Group Center moved toward Moscow and Army Group South toward Ukraine. By October, Soviet resistance stiffened. German supply lines stretched over distances exceeding 800 kilometers, and winter conditions began to alter operational capacity. The town of Kholm lay in the Novgorod region, positioned near the Lovat River basin. It controlled road access between Staraya Russa, Toropets, and Velikiye Luki. Before the war, Kholm had a population of approximately 6,500 civilians. Its value was not industrial, but logistical. It sat on the edge of forested and swamp terrain that limited armored maneuver and forced reliance on narrow road corridors. For the German command, holding Kholm allowed protection of the southern flank of Army Group North and secured a supply artery feeding forces positioned east of Staraya Russa. By November 1941, Soviet forces launched a series of counteroffensives following the failure of the German drive on Moscow. The Soviet Northwestern Front, under General Pavel Kurochkin, initiated an offensive toward Toropets and Kholm with the objective of cutting German communication lines and isolating forward garrisons. The operation involved the 3rd and 4th Shock Armies, both newly formed and reinforced with infantry divisions, ski brigades, artillery regiments, and limited armor. Their combined strength in the region exceeded 140,000 personnel by December. Inside Kholm, the German garrison consisted of approximately 5,500, 6,000 personnel at the outset. The corps included elements of the 218th Infantry Division, security battalions, auxiliary police units, construction detachments, and medical formations. Heavy equipment presence was minimal, fewer than 20 operational artillery pieces, limited anti-tank weaponry, and almost no armored vehicles. Supply reserves were calculated for routine rear area defense duties and not for prolonged siege conditions. German intelligence assessed Soviet activity in the sector as fragmented and underestimated both the scale and coordination of the upcoming offensive. Soviet reconnaissance, meanwhile, identified Kholm as a logistical node rather than a fortress, expecting that the garrison would abandon the town under pressure rather than attempt prolonged defense. Neither side initially anticipated a long-term encirclement. Civilian conditions prior to the siege were deteriorating rapidly. Food requisitioning by occupation authorities had already reduced local grain stores by more than 60% compared to pre-war levels. Medical services were minimal, with one small hospital serving both civilian and military needs. Winter temperatures in the region during December 1941 ranged from 18 degrees Celsius to 32 degrees Celsius. Snow depth exceeded 40 centimeters in most off-road areas, severely constraining vehicle movement. Politically, the Soviet leadership viewed the winter of 1941-42 as an opportunity to destroy isolated German groups before they could re-establish coherent defensive lines. The Stavka Directive, issued in early January 1942, ordered sustained pressure across multiple fronts, including localized encirclement operations. German High Command, meanwhile, issued standing orders prohibiting unauthorized withdrawal from forward positions, reinforcing the concept of holding towns and road junctions regardless of isolation. By the second week of January 1942, Soviet forces had broken through several German security divisions west of Kholm and Toropets. German units were fragmented, with many formations reduced below 50% of their November strength. Weather conditions prevented large-scale German airlift operations and delayed reinforcements. Communications between isolated garrisons relied increasingly on radio rather than landline networks. At this point, Kholm remained connected to German rear areas by a single vulnerable road corridor. That corridor would be severed within days, marking the transition from rear area occupation to full operational isolation. The preconditions for a prolonged siege were in place before either side formally recognized that such a situation had begun. On 8 January 1942, Soviet forward units from the 3rd Shock Army initiated the first phase of the Toropets-Kholm offensive. The operation began with concentrated infantry assaults, supported by artillery batteries positioned east and southeast of the town. Initial Soviet strength in the immediate Kholm sector is estimated at 20,000–24,000 personnel, drawn primarily from the 33rd and 257th Rifle Divisions, supported by ski battalions adapted for deep snow movement. German defenders inside Kholm at that moment numbered approximately 5,300–5,600 troops. On 10 January, Soviet forces cut the final road connection linking Kholm with Staraya Russa by capturing several key villages along the Lovat Basin. This action formally isolated the German garrison. Within the same 48-hour window, Soviet artillery began systematic fire against the town perimeter using 76mm 122mm field guns. German counter-battery fire was limited by ammunition shortages and poor observation conditions caused by snowfall and smoke from burning structures. German command of the garrison was assumed by General Theodor Scherer of the 218th Infantry Division. He organized the defense into 4 main sectors using improvised strongpoints constructed from stone buildings, cellars, and earthworks reinforced with timber. Defensive depth varied from 200 to 600 meters depending on terrain. No continuous trench system existed at the outset. Available anti-tank assets consisted of fewer than 30 functional 37mm and 50mm guns. Between 11 and 15 January, Soviet infantry conducted repeated frontal assaults on the southern and eastern edges of the town. Daily assault strength ranged from battalion to regimental size. German defensive fire caused measurable losses. Soviet casualty reports for this initial phase record approximately 1,200–1,500 killed and wounded. German losses for the same period are estimated at 300–400 personnel, primarily from artillery fire and close combat inside outer defensive positions. On 16 January, the Luftwaffe conducted its first emergency air resupply mission to Kholm. Using Ju-52 transports operating from forward airfields near Dino, approximately 12 tons of food, ammunition, and medical supplies were delivered by parachute drop. Only 60–70% of the cargo was recovered due to wind drift and Soviet fire. Subsequent resupply flights during January averaged 8 to 15 tons per day under favorable weather, with several days of total interruption due to fog or snowfall. Soviet command initially expected the town to fall within 7 to 10 days. As assault casualties increased and German resistance remained intact, Soviet units shifted toward gradual encirclement tightening. Artillery concentrations increased from an average of 600 rounds per day to over 1,400 rounds per day by late January. Civilian losses inside the encirclement rose as residential structures were struck. By 25 January, approximately 480 civilians remained sheltering inside the town, many wounded and without access to consistent medical care. At the end of January, temperatures repeatedly dropped below 30 degrees C. Frostbite became a major factor on both sides. German medical logs indicate more than 600 frostbite cases by 1 February, reducing effective manpower by over 10%. Soviet medical units reported comparable rates, particularly among ski battalions conducting night infiltration attempts through marsh terrain. By early February, the siege had fully stabilized into a continuous encirclement. All German ground communication with rear forces had ceased. Soviet forces controlled all road access points at distances between 1.5 and 4 kilometers from the town center. The operational phase had shifted from rapid isolation to sustained siege warfare, with both sides transitioning from maneuver to attrition. By early February 1942, both Soviet and German commands had shifted from initial operational expectations to deliberate siege planning. For the Soviet Northwestern Front, the encirclement of Kholm served two primary objectives: to eliminate a German road hub controlling movement between Staraya Russa and Toropets, and to stabilize the southern flank of operations aimed toward Velikie Luki and Demyansk. Stavka directives issued between 20 and 28 January emphasized the destruction of isolated enemy groupings as a prerequisite for broader winter operations. The 3rd Shock Army was reinforced with additional artillery regiments and engineer units, raising its sector strength near Kholm to approximately 28,000–32,000 personnel by mid-February. Soviet logistical planning relied almost entirely on overland supply routes through Toropets and Ostashkov. Rail support terminated more than 120 kilometers from the front line, requiring continuous truck and horse transport through forest roads exposed to air attack and winter conditions. Daily Soviet ammunition expenditure around Kholm averaged 40–60 tons by February, requiring stabilized supply schedules under conditions of snow depth exceeding 50 centimeters. Fuel shortages limited sustained armored deployments to short, localized actions, with no more than 15–20 tanks available at any given time in the siege zone. German strategic intent was shaped by two simultaneous priorities: maintaining the Kholm position as a blocking point and preventing Soviet breakthrough toward the rear of Army Group North, while preparing a relief operation from the west. Army Group North assigned the task of eventual relief to elements of the 218th Infantry Division, the 58th Infantry Division, and mobile detachments drawn from security and police formations. Available German ground forces for relief operations in February did not exceed 18,000–20,000 troops within operational reach of Kholm. Air resupply became the sole method of sustaining the garrison. From 1st February to 20th February, the Luftwaffe conducted an average of 18–22 sorties per day to the Kholm pocket, primarily using Ju-52 transports, with limited participation of He-111 bombers adapted for supply drops. Average daily delivered tonnage fluctuated between 25 and 40 tons under clear weather. Recorded payload distribution for this phase shows that food constituted approximately 38%, ammunition 34%, medical supplies 12%, fuel 9%, and communications equipment the remainder. Aircraft loss rates averaged 6 to 8% per week due to Soviet ground fire and operational accidents. Inside the pocket, German command reorganized force structure into fixed defense sectors. Infantry companies were consolidated into composite battalions of 250–300 effectives per unit. By 10 February, total combat effective manpower inside Kholm had declined to approximately 4,200–4,500 troops due to combat losses, frost injuries, and disease. Ammunition stocks were rationed to pre-registered fire plans, limiting most defensive engagements to controlled bursts rather than sustained barrages. Soviet planning in this period shifted toward systematic reduction of the pocket through artillery dominance and infiltration tactics. Night assault groups composed of 20–40 personnel were tasked with probing defense lines, destroying individual strong points, and disrupting airdrop recovery zones. Between 5 and 18th February, more than 30 such infiltration attempts were recorded in Soviet operational logs. German after-action reports indicate that 11 of these assaults achieved temporary penetration into the outer defense belt but were repelled within 2 to 6 hours. Psychological conditions were formally assessed by both sides. Soviet political departments reported declining morale among some newly mobilized formations due to prolonged exposure without decisive results. German internal medical summaries noted an increase in exhaustion-related psychosis cases beginning in mid-February, with daily medical admissions rising from 18 to 22 cases in late January to 36 to 41 cases per day by 20 February. Propaganda activity intensified during this phase. Soviet loudspeaker units broadcast surrender appeals daily, often accompanied by written leaflets delivered by artillery shells. German command prohibited response to these messages and reinforced internal discipline through rotating night patrols and centralized ration control. By the end of February 1942, both sides had established defined siege doctrines around Kholm. Soviet forces transitioned from rapid assault to structured operational pressure aimed at resource exhaustion. German command committed fully to maintaining the pocket until a breakout or relief could be executed. With logistics, manpower, and weather integrated into planning on both sides, the conflict entered a phase of prolonged positional confrontation. Between late February and mid-March 1942, the first sustained series of large-scale ground engagements around Kholm took place as Soviet command initiated coordinated reduction efforts against the outer and inner defensive belts. On 24 February, artillery concentrations were increased to an average of 1/800 to 2/100 rounds per day, targeting known German firing positions, supply drop zones, and command nodes identified through observation and prisoner interrogation. Fire missions were executed primarily by 76mm divisional guns, 122mm howitzers, and limited numbers of 152mm heavy artillery pieces. On 26 February, the 257th Rifle Division initiated a coordinated assault against the southeastern sector of the German perimeter, committing approximately 3,200 infantry supported by 14 T-26 and BT series tanks. Due to minefields and anti-tank obstacles constructed from timber and debris, 7 Soviet tanks were disabled within the first 2 hours of combat. German anti-tank fire was conducted primarily by 50mm PaK-38 guns and bundled explosive charges used at close range. Soviet assault forces penetrated to a depth of 300-400 meters before being halted by concentrated machine gun fire from reinforced stone buildings along the central street axis. German defensive consumption during this 48-hour action exceeded 38,000 rounds of small arms ammunition and nearly 1,200 artillery shells. Soviet loss reports for the assault indicate approximately 640 killed and 1,100 wounded. German casualties for the same engagement are recorded at 210 killed and 390 wounded. Civilian shelters within the southeastern quarter were directly impacted by artillery strikes, leading to the deaths of at least 56 civilians during this phase. On 2 March, Soviet forces shifted focus to the northern sector of the perimeter, employing infiltration tactics through wooded terrain at night. Assault detachments numbering 25-40 personnel attempted to isolate individual German strongpoints using satchel charges and flamethrowers. Between 2 and 6 March, 9 such attempts were recorded. German defensive logs confirm that 3 strongpoints were temporarily overrun and later reclaimed in counterattacks lasting between 90 minutes and 4 hours. During this period, German manpower fell below 4,000 effectives for the first time, while Soviet frontline strength remained above 25,000. Air resupply during early March became increasingly irregular. Between 1 and 10 March, only 132 tons of supplies were successfully delivered to Kholm instead of the projected 240 tons required to sustain full defensive consumption. During this same interval, the Luftwaffe lost 6 Ju-52 aircraft to anti-aircraft fire and 2 to mechanical failures during landing attempts on improvised frozen strips inside the pocket. Fuel reserves inside the perimeter fell below 30% of minimum operational requirements, forcing a reduction in generator usage for communications and medical equipment. Weather conditions continued to influence operations. Daytime temperatures rose to 6°C to 3°C, while nighttime remained below 15°C. Partial thawing during daylight hours turned outer defensive zones into mud and slush, reducing Soviet infantry mobility while also collapsing sections of German earthworks. Medical evacuation capacity inside Kholm became critically strained. By 12th of March, over 1,200 wounded were being treated inside facilities originally designed for fewer than 400 patients. On 14th March, Soviet command ordered a synchronized pincer-style assault from the east and southwest using elements of the 33rd and 257th Rifle Divisions. The attack began after a 90-minute artillery barrage involving approximately 3,000 shells. German defenses absorbed the initial impact with heavy losses, but by dusk, Soviet forces advanced only 200-250 meters in most sectors. The failure to achieve a breakthrough resulted in the suspension of large-scale assaults, for the remainder of March, in favor of continued artillery pressure and attritional tactics. By the end of March, Soviet forces had closed the average distance from the German perimeter to between 800 and 1,200 meters in several sectors. However, no sector collapse had yet occurred. The battle had evolved from initial probing attacks into sustained positional combat characterized by short-range engagements, continuous artillery exposure, and steadily diminishing manpower on both sides. Between late March and mid-April 1942, the Kholm encirclement entered a phase defined by cumulative logistical collapse, rising casualty density, and growing command instability on both sides. Soviet artillery fire became nearly continuous rather than episodic. Operational records from the 3rd Shock Army indicate daily averages of 2,200–2,600 shells fired into the pocket between 25 March and 12 April. Approximately 62% of these rounds were allocated to suppression of airdrop recovery zones and radio relay points, directly targeting the sustainment system sustaining the German garrison. German ammunition stocks reached critical thresholds by early April. Small arms issue was reduced to no more than 40 rounds per rifle per week. By mid-April, Soviet forward trenches in several eastern sectors lay within 350–500 meters of the inner German defense line, compared to over 1,200 meters in mid-February. Casualties accumulated steadily. German strength inside the pocket declined from approximately 3,900 effectives at the end of March to around 3,200 by 15th April. Medical logs recorded 1,870 additional combat wounded during this period and more than 900 frostbite and disease cases, primarily trench foot, pneumonia, and severe malnutrition. Soviet losses between 25 March and 15th April are estimated at approximately 1,900 killed and 3,400 wounded, based on divisional medical evacuation records. Air resupply capacity deteriorated sharply. From 5 to 14 April, poor visibility, thawing landing strips, and Soviet anti-aircraft fire restricted deliveries to an average of only 9–11 tons per day, against minimum requirements exceeding 30 tons. Of 98 attempted sorties in this interval, 17 aircraft were lost or severely damaged. 2 improvised frozen runways inside the pocket became unusable by 10 April due to surface collapse, forcing exclusive reliance on parachute drops, which reduced cargo recovery efficiency below 55%. Civilian conditions reached terminal levels during this phase. Of the estimated 480 civilians remaining in January, fewer than 110 were still alive by mid-April. Mortality resulted from artillery strikes, starvation, untreated infections, and exposure. German command records show that civilian ration distribution officially ceased on 2nd April due to supply prioritization orders issued by Army Group North. Command stress intensified on both sides. Within the German pocket, officer casualties exceeded 38% by mid-April, disrupting sector coordination. Soviet command experienced battalion-level relief rotations due to fatigue and attrition, particularly among assault engineer units. Political departments documented rising disciplinary issues linked to frontal exhaustion and sustained losses without decisive penetration. International strategic pressure also influenced this phase. Stavka issued repeated directives demanding rapid liquidation of the pocket to release shock army formations for operations further north. Simultaneously, German Army Group North faced mounting pressure from the OKH to eliminate isolated formations, draining air transport capacity required elsewhere on the Eastern Front. By the second week of April 1942, the operational situation had entered a crisis equilibrium. Soviet forces had not yet breached the core defensive belt, while German defenders had lost the logistical margin required for prolonged survival. The siege had reached a stage where continued resistance depended entirely on the timing of an external relief effort rather than internal defensive capacity. Between mid-April and early May 1942, the battle for Kholm entered its most intensive operational phase as both sides committed maximum available resources within the shrinking engagement zone. On 18th April, the Soviet 3rd Shock Army initiated a coordinated high-density offensive involving the 33rd, 257th, and 391st Rifle Divisions, supported by 3 independent artillery regiments and 2 sapper brigades. Total Soviet forces engaged directly in this phase exceeded 18,000 personnel, with an additional 9,000 assigned to containment, logistics, and reserve functions. Artillery preparation for the main assault on 18th April lasted 110 minutes and involved approximately 4,200 shells across all calibers. Fire density reached its peak rate during the siege, averaging 1 shell per 18 square meters of the targeted sector. The main Soviet effort was directed against the western defensive arc, where German sector strength had fallen below 900 effectives. Soviet assault elements advanced behind rolling artillery fire and smoke screens generated by chemical smoke projectors. Initial breakthroughs were achieved in 2 subsectors with penetration depths of up to 480 meters within the first 6 hours. German counterattacks were executed using remnants of reserve platoons consolidated into ad hoc assault groups, numbering 20-35 soldiers each. These counteractions restored partial control over one penetration corridor, but failed to eliminate the second breach until after 36 hours of continuous combat. Casualty density during this period reached its highest recorded values. Between 18 and 25 April, German medical records document 740 killed and 1,320 wounded, representing approximately 42% of total remaining manpower. Soviet losses during the same interval are estimated at 1,480 killed and 2,670 wounded, based on combined divisional medical evacuation reports. Air resupply during the peak phase operated under nearly continuous fire. Between 19 and 30 April, the Luftwaffe flew 217 supply sorties to the pocket. Of these, 39 aircraft were lost to anti-aircraft fire or failed landings. A total of 362 tons of cargo were delivered, of which only 196 tons were recovered by German units. Ammunition constituted 41% of recovered supplies, food 33%, medical materials 15%, and fuel the remainder. Medical infrastructure inside Kholm collapsed under the volume of casualties. By 24 April, patient density exceeded 1,900 wounded in facilities originally constructed to accommodate fewer than 500. Surgical operations were conducted without continuous anesthesia due to narcotic shortages. Average infection rates among untreated wounds reached 68%. Mortality among severely wounded personnel exceeded 52% by the end of April. Civilian presence inside the defensive perimeter had effectively ended by this phase. The remaining civilians, estimated at fewer than 40 persons in early April, disappeared from medical and ration logs by 23 April, indicating complete loss of organized civilian survival within the encirclement. On 27 April, Soviet engineering units began tunnel-based demolition efforts against forward German strongpoints in the northern sector. 2 underground charges were detonated beneath stone structures used as German command relay nodes. One position was destroyed entirely, while the second suffered partial collapse. German communications in that sector were interrupted for 19 hours. Despite territorial compression, the Soviet command failed to achieve a full perimeter rupture. The remaining German Defensive Corps retained uninterrupted radio communication with Army Group North and maintained coordinated fire plans across all surviving sectors. However, by early May, German combat effective strength had fallen below 2,100 personnel. By 3rd May 1942, both sides reached the operational saturation point. Soviet units had expended over 78% of their forward artillery ammunition allocations, while German stockpiles inside the pocket had declined to less than 5 days of sustained defensive fire. The peak of the campaign concluded not with decisive collapse, but with total systemic exhaustion on both sides, making the next operational phase dependent on external maneuver rather than internal attrition. From early May to mid-May 1942, both sides entered a phase defined by adaptive tactics, resource substitution, and localized counteraction rather than large-scale maneuver. For the German garrison, survival depended on restructuring defensive doctrine from sector-based static resistance to elastic micro-defense centered on surviving strongpoints. Infantry units were reorganized into cell-based fire groups of 8 to 12 soldiers operating from rubble, basements, and collapsed timber shelters. Command decentralization became mandatory after officer casualties exceeded 45% by 6th May. German engineering personnel improvised defensive measures using non-standard materials. Anti-tank barriers were constructed from aircraft wreckage, sled frames, and collapsed roofing beams. Explosive charges were repurposed from aerial bombs that failed to detonate during Soviet artillery strikes. Ammunition recycling units were formed to recover and sort usable cartridges from battlefield debris. Between 4 and 14 May, over 38,000 rounds of mixed-caliber small arms ammunition were salvaged and redistributed. Soviet forces also shifted methods. Recognizing the diminishing return of massed frontal assault, 3rd Shock Army Command increased emphasis on progressive encirclement tightening and structural annihilation. Assault engineering detachments expanded from company to battalion scale. These units specialized in demolition of fortified buildings using satchel charges of 12-18 kilograms and coordinated suppression fire. Between 5 and 15 May, Soviet records indicate 62 individual demolition operations executed within 700 meters of the inner German defensive ring. Psychological endurance became a measurable parameter. German medical documentation registered a sustained increase in combat fatigue syndromes, tremor disorders, dissociative episodes, and acute exhaustion, rising from an average of 22 daily admissions in April to over 40 per day by mid-May. Soviet medical brigades registered similar increases, particularly among assault engineers, where average operational lifespan in the forward zone fell to 9-11 days before evacuation for injury or exhaustion. Air operations continued but under worsening conditions. From 4 to 18 May, 164 Luftwaffe sorties attempted resupply. Of these, 31 aircraft were destroyed, primarily by heavy machine gun and 37mm anti-aircraft fire. Total delivered tonnage during the same interval was 241 tons, with a recovery rate of only 58%. Food component of daily supply fell below 500 grams per soldier by 12 May. Horses inside the pocket, previously reserved for transport, were slaughtered for protein supplementation. Soviet adaptation included expansion of close-range indirect fire. Modified 50mm and 82mm mortars were employed at minimum distances of 70-90 meters, allowing plunging fire into shell crater shelters. Between 7 and 16 May, an average of 620 mortar rounds per day impacted within the inner 1 square kilometer defensive zone. Despite continuous compression, German units launched 11 localized counterattacks during this phase, primarily aimed at disrupting Soviet demolition teams and reclaiming collapsed firing points. These actions rarely exceeded platoon strength and typically lasted 20-90 minutes. German combat logs record 94 killed and 183 wounded from counterattacks between 6 and 15th May. Soviet losses resulting from these counteractions totaled approximately 260 killed and 410 wounded. Command structures adapted dynamically. German radio discipline shifted toward low-duration, high-priority burst transmission to avoid triangulation. Soviet command established forward mobile command posts within 800 meters of the contact line to reduce latency in fire coordination. Signal casualty rates exceeded 30% on both sides by mid-May. Civilians were no longer present in organized form inside the pocket. All recorded non-combatant rations ended on 20-30 April. Subsequent medical logs show only uniformed personnel. By 18th of May 1942, the battle had entered a condition of sustained micro-combat governed by exhaustion rather than maneuver. Neither side possessed sufficient surplus manpower, ammunition, or mobility to force resolution through internal action alone. The operational outcome now depended entirely on the success or failure of external relief efforts converging on the shrinking Kholm perimeter. By mid-May 1942, the decisive shift in the operational balance around Kholm emerged not from inside the encirclement, but from the west, where German relief formations had been reorganized for a final corridor-breaking effort. Army Group North concentrated available mobile reserves under conditions of severe manpower shortage. The primary relief force was assembled from elements of the 218th Infantry Division, the 329th Infantry Regiment, parts of the 8th Light Infantry Brigade, and reinforced security battalions. Total relief force strength by 15th May did not exceed 8,500-9,200 personnel, supported by 24 field guns, 12 heavy mortars, and 9 operational armored vehicles, mainly captured Soviet T-60s and German armored cars. The relief operation began on 21 May 1942, following a preparatory artillery fire totaling approximately 4,800 shells over a 90-minute period. German units advanced from the southwest toward the Lovet River crossings, attempting to break through Soviet outer containment zones held by the 257th and 391st Rifle Divisions. Initial German penetration reached depths of 1.6 to 2.1 kilometers by the end of the first day. Soviet response involved the rapid commitment of 2 rifle regiments and 1 anti-tank brigade, raising immediate defensive manpower in the breakthrough sector to over 6,000 troops. Between 22 and 25 May, combat concentrated along a corridor less than 4 kilometers wide. Daily casualty densities reached their highest recorded values outside the pocket itself. German relief forces suffered approximately 1,160 killed and 2,030 wounded in this 4-day interval. Soviet losses in the same zone are recorded at approximately 1,180 killed and 3,400 wounded. Artillery expenditure on both sides exceeded 9,000 shells across this phase alone. Simultaneously, the Kholm garrison initiated coordinated breakout actions timed to coincide with the external advance. On 23 May, 2 German assault columns totaling approximately 620 personnel launched attacks from the western pocket sectors under covering fire from remaining artillery pieces and heavy machine guns. These attacks reduced the distance to the approaching relief force to less than 1,200 meters, but failed to establish a direct link due to heavy Soviet fire from intermediate trench networks. On 26 May, weather conditions shifted temporarily in favor of ground operations. Temperatures stabilized above 0 degrees C overnight, reducing ice crust formation and allowing tracked movement. German relief units achieved their deepest penetration on this date, reaching within 850 meters of the pocket perimeter. Soviet command responded by deploying reserve battalions of the 33rd Rifle Division and intensifying mortar fire at rates exceeding 900 rounds per day along the corridor axis. The operational turning point occurred on 27 May 1942, after a concentrated artillery barrage of approximately 2,100 shells fired in 75 minutes. German relief forces executed a combined frontal infiltration attack supported by limited armor. Soviet defenses in one central sector trench belt collapsed due to ammunition depletion and fatigue. At 1440 local time, forward elements of the German relief column made direct physical contact with an outbound German patrol from the pocket at a distance of approximately 700 meters west of Kholm. The corridor width at the initial point of contact measured between 180 and 230 meters under continuous fire from both sides. By the evening of 27 May, a provisional ground corridor had been established. However, it remained under constant artillery and small arms fire. Soviet counterattacks between 28 and 29 May attempted to sever the corridor 5 times using battalion-level assaults supported by anti-tank guns and mortars. These attempts resulted in approximately 640 additional Soviet casualties. German losses in maintaining the corridor reached approximately 310 killed and 540 wounded during these 2 days. Logistical flow through the corridor remained limited. Between 28 and 31 May, only 162 wounded were evacuated from the pocket by ground transport, while 118 tons of supplies were successfully pushed inward. This represented less than 60% of minimum emergency resupply requirements. Nevertheless, the existence of the land connection marked a fundamental operational shift. The encirclement had been broken, though not yet fully stabilized. The relief did not end organized Soviet pressure. Artillery fire continued uninterrupted, and the corridor remained vulnerable to closure. However, from 27 May onward, the German garrison was no longer fully isolated. The siege had entered its irreversible breaking phase, with the strategic initiative passing from internal attrition to external operational maneuver. Between 30 May and mid-June 1942, organized combat operations around Kholm transitioned from siege conditions to phased disengagement, evacuation, and force realignment. After the establishment of the Provisional Land Corridor on 27 May, German command prioritized three objectives: stabilization of the corridor width, evacuation of non-ambulatory wounded, and withdrawal of the most exhausted defensive units from the pocket interior. Corridor security initially relied on a defensive belt only 250-400 meters wide, continuously exposed to Soviet mortar and artillery fire. From 30 May to 5th June, Soviet forces conducted repeated attempts to cut the corridor using battalion and regimental-sized assault groups supported by anti-tank artillery and short-range mortars. A total of 9 confirmed corridor severing attempts were executed in this period. The most severe engagement occurred on 2nd June, when elements of the 33rd Rifle Division achieved a temporary penetration of 180 meters into the corridor before being forced back by German counterfire and localized armored support. Soviet casualties in corridor counteroffensives between 30 May and 5th June are estimated at approximately 1,120 killed and 1,940 wounded. German losses for the same interval reached approximately 410 killed and 760 wounded. Evacuation operations from inside the pocket commenced immediately after corridor contact. Between 28th May and 8th June, 1,120 wounded were transported out of Kholm by ground vehicles and sled convoys under continuous fire. Medical evacuation capacity remained critically limited. Average daily evacuation did not exceed 160 patients. An estimated 680 severely wounded German personnel died inside the pocket during this same period due to delayed evacuation and untreated infections. Material extraction followed medical priority. Between 29 May and 10 June, approximately 186 tons of supply stockpiles remaining inside Kholm were removed through the corridor, including radio systems, remaining artillery breech components, medical equipment, and ammunition stocks. Heavy weapons that could not be extracted were destroyed by demolition teams. By 4th June, all remaining artillery pieces inside the former encirclement were rendered inoperable to prevent capture. Soviet command gradually reduced assault pressure after 7 June as Stavka redirected shock army resources toward operations northwest of Velikiye Luki. Artillery fire decreased from late May peak levels of 1,800 and 2,100 shells per day to fewer than 600 shells per day by 12 June. Infantry assault shifted from penetration attempts to rearguard harassment of the evacuation corridor. Final German withdrawal from Kholm proper began on 7 June 1942. The operation was conducted in 3 successive echelons over 6 nights under continuous night movement discipline. Rearguard detachments maintained firing positions until evacuation columns cleared successive road segments. The last organized German units departed the Kholm town perimeter on the night of 12 through 13 June. Demolition charges were detonated across remaining fortified structures, command shelters, and supply cellars before withdrawal completion. By 14th June, Soviet forces reoccupied the ruins of Kholm without organized resistance. Medical and burial detachments immediately documented the battlefield. Soviet reports registered over 3,200 German dead inside the former pocket area, while German operational summaries estimated that between January and June 1942, total garrison losses amounted to approximately 3,850 killed and 6,150 wounded from an initial force of 5,500-6,000. Soviet total losses directly attributable to siege operations from January through June are estimated at approximately 11,000-12,000 killed and 23,000-25,000 wounded across all participating formations. Civil infrastructure in Kholm was almost entirely destroyed. Of the town's 640 pre-war residential buildings, fewer than 40 remained structurally intact after Soviet reoccupation. All industrial workshops, storage depots, the hospital complex, and the central water distribution network were rendered non-functional. The remaining civilian population at the time of Soviet re-entry numbered fewer than 60 persons, all suffering from advanced malnutrition and untreated illness. With the evacuation complete, Kholm ceased to function as a defensive node. The corridor itself was dissolved within 72 hours of final withdrawal as German forces fell back to shortened defensive lines west of the Lovat Basin. Organized combat operations at Kholm formally concluded on 13th of June 1942, marking the end of direct fighting after 105 consecutive days of siege, encirclement, and relief operations. In the months following the end of combat at Kholm, both German and Soviet commands conducted formal assessments of the siege as part of broader evaluations of the Winter-Spring campaign of 1941-1942. For the German Army Group North, the Kholm pocket was classified as one of several isolated strongpoints whose survival had depended entirely on sustained air resupply and limited external relief operations. Alongside Demyansk, Kholm became a reference case in operational studies of encirclement defense, particularly regarding airlift dependency under winter conditions. From January to June 1942, the Luftwaffe flew approximately 2,450 supply sorties toward the Kholm pocket. Total delivered cargo across the entire siege is estimated at 4,600 tons, of which German recovery rates ranged between 55% and 70%, depending on weather and Soviet fire intensity. Aircraft losses attributed directly to Kholm resupply operations reached at least 108 transport and bomber aircraft destroyed or written off. These losses imposed measurable strain on Luftwaffe transport capacity during a period when German airlift assets were also supporting operations at Demyansk, Vyazma, and Rzhev. German personnel losses across the full duration of the siege, from 10th of January to 13th June 1942, are assessed at approximately 3,800, 4,000 killed, and 6,500 wounded, from an initial garrison estimated between 5,500 and 6,000 personnel. These numbers indicate that total casualties exceeded the original strength of the encircled force. The proportion of wounded who died before evacuation, estimated at 10 to 12%, reflected the collapse of medical infrastructure during the peak of fighting in April and May. Soviet losses during the Kholm operation were evaluated in multiple post-war studies of the Northwestern Front. Aggregated casualties across all participating formations, primarily the 3rd Shock Army and subordinate rifle divisions, are estimated at approximately $11,000, 12,500 killed, and 23,000 to 26,000 wounded between January and June 1942. These losses were distributed unevenly, with the highest concentrations occurring during the March and April assault phases and during resistance to the German relief breakthrough in late May. Strategically, the siege fixed multiple Soviet divisions for over 4 months in terrain of limited operational depth. While the encirclement initially aligned with Stavka directives to destroy isolated enemy groupings, the failure to liquidate the pocket prior to German relief imposed opportunity costs. Shock Army formations tied to Kholm were not available for the spring offensives towards Staraya Russa and Velikiye Luki at full strength. At the same time, German ability to sustain Kholm reinforced confidence within the German High Command in the feasibility of air-supplied encircled positions, contributing to later decisions that overestimated Luftwaffe transport capacity during 1942-1943. For the civilian population of Kholm, the siege resulted in near-total demographic collapse. Pre-war population of approximately 6,500 was reduced to fewer than 60 surviving residents by the time of Soviet reoccupation in June 1942. More than 96% of residential structures were destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. Agricultural infrastructure in the surrounding district was similarly devastated. delaying post-war recovery until at least 1945. Post-war commemoration of the siege followed divergent trajectories. In Soviet historical writing, Kholm was incorporated into broader narratives of winter counteroffensives and partisan warfare in the Northwestern Theater, though it received less emphasis than operations at Demyansk or Rzhev. In German military studies, Kholm was examined extensively as a case study in isolated defense under air supply, with detailed logistical and medical analyses published in the 1960s and 1970s. No international tribunals or post-war investigations specifically addressed war crimes linked exclusively to the siege, though civilian mortality from starvation and artillery fire was documented in regional Soviet archives. Archaeological recovery operations conducted intermittently from the 1950s through the 1990s recovered thousands of remains from both sides in and around the former defensive perimeter. By the end of the 20th century, Kholm had become a documented example of prolonged positional warfare within a mobile campaign context. The siege demonstrated the interaction between air logistics, terrain constraints, and attritional land combat over an uninterrupted period of 105 days. Its legacy persists primarily through archival records, military studies, and the physical remnants of fortifications still visible in the surrounding landscape.